Good evening. Welcome to the Triangle Roundtable on Science and Religion. We're absolutely delighted that so many of you were able to join us this evening. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for the evening, Dr. Sarah Windsor. Dr. Windsor is a STEM community builder. She has leadership experience in the nonprofit, academic, and government sectors. She most recently served as a director of STEM RTP, the STEM Education Initiative of the Research Triangle Foundation. STEM RTP works to increase access to and understanding of the STEM fields to underserved populations, specifically girls, students from low-income backgrounds, and underrepresented minorities. I don't know about you, but I love that vision. Sarah has an extensive mix of triangle flavor. She earned her undergrad degree from NC State, her PhD in microbiology from UNC Chapel Hill, and completed a postdoc fellowship at North Carolina Central University and at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, genomics and microbiology lab. She also served as a local RTP president of Graduate Women in Science, GWIS, and is a member of Sigma Xi. She is passionate about the following: societal scientific literacy, fostering intellectual curiosity, faith and science, women in STEM, and of course, bacteria. And now it is my pleasure to hand the virtual mic to Dr. Sarah Windsor, our moderator.
Thank you, Fred, for that wonderful introduction. It's been my pleasure to collaborate with the folks at the Center for Christianity and Scholarship at Duke and both our panelists tonight for this discussion. During my career, I've enjoyed being at the crossroads of science and the Christian faith while being a part of multiple microbiology labs and attending church here in Raleigh. These crossroad conversations can be pleasant or uncomfortable, but they're always highly rewarding. In fact, even the title for tonight's discussion, The Competition of Science and Religion in the Public Square, will be grounds for crossroad conversations. With that, I'm very eager to moderate this discussion with two esteemed guests and talk through topics around the cosmos, humanity, and their application to society during this Triangle Roundtable. Without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Dan Skolnick is an assistant professor in physics at Duke University. He received his Bachelor's of Science from MIT and then his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He was awarded both a NASA Hubble Fellowship and a Kavli Institute for Cosmological Physics Fellowship for his postdoctoral work at the University of Chicago. Dr. Skolnick started at Duke 2 years ago and last year won the prestigious Packard Fellowship for the nation's most promising early career scientists and engineers. At Duke, he teaches stellar astrophysics for graduate students and the physics of sports for undergraduates. His research focuses on cosmology and the understanding of the expansion of the universe. Our next panelist is Ian Hutchinson. He is a professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT. Dr. Hutchinson received his Bachelor of Arts in Physics from Cambridge University and his PhD in engineering physics from the Australian National University, where he was a Commonwealth Scholar. He was elected as a Fellow of the American Physical Society in 1988 and served as Chairman of the Division of Plasma Physics Group in 2008. Through his stellar career, Dr. Hutchinson has published over 200 journal articles and 2 textbooks on a variety of plasma phenomena and on the topic of nuclear fission. He has written and spoken widely on the relationship between science and the Christian faith, including authoring a 2011 book titled Monopolizing Knowledge and speaking through BioLogos Foundation and Veritas forums like this. To you both, Dan and Ian, we thank you for being part of this panel and we welcome you here tonight. For everyone joining online, we hope this is a fruitful and approachable conversation on the intersection of science and religion. Dan and Ian, to start off the evening, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're zooming from, your personal background, and to lighten the mood a little bit, what made you laugh most recently? Dan, if you could go first.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this. So I'm an assistant professor, and I am here in the Duke Physics building with, I think, no one else in the building, but I have 2 kids at home, so this is the only place where I could get a little bit of quiet. I have been doing science for a while, but my father is a rabbi, so this intersection of science and religion is something that's I'm very intrigued in and excited to talk about. And something that made me laugh recently, so I just had my last lecture for stellar astrophysics, and it's in the morning, and my wife had a dentist appointment at the same time, and my youngest daughter, her school wasn't on that day, and I had this whole plan that I would have this video set up for my younger daughter, and I could give my lecture and everything with peace. And in about 1 minute, my daughter climbed up on me. She started asking me to use the computer, and then she threw an epic tantrum for about 15 minutes. And I thought, like, I had 1 class to go for this whole semester, and I was doing so well, and then it was just like mayhem. But what makes me happy about it is that I hit the record button before I started. So 10 years from now, when this is a bit of a memory, I can enjoy this because it was crazy.
Ian, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. It's great to be here. I've done a number of roundtables in person, but this is the first one that I've been a part of online. So let's hope everything goes well. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. You can probably tell from my accent that I grew up in the United Kingdom, and I became a Christian when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University, just to give you a little bit of background. And having spent time also in Australia, I've lived in the United States now for more than 40 years. My kids, my 2 children grew up here, and I now have 4 grandchildren not living with me, so not likely to break into this Zoom session, unfortunately. I was hard pressed to give you an answer about what was the latest thing that made me laugh, because I laugh so much. I mean, it goes from one thing to another. One of the things that my wife and I love to do is to watch Netflix from time to time. The funniest show that I'm watching on Netflix at the moment is The Good Place. Its theology is terrible, but it has some great characters, and I can really identify with Chidi, who is the academic. He's actually a philosopher, but he's OCD and he's pathologically unable to make decisions, and I just love that character.
Oh, well, thank you guys both for sharing that. I haven't seen The Good Place, but I heard it also is pretty fun. So let's dive into that first question. So in pre-pandemic times, when you are on an elevator with a stranger, how would you describe to them what science is and how it informs your view on the nature of cosmos? So that's a pretty big question. Dan, if you could take a stab at it first.
Right. Yeah. So to me, science is 2 things, and they are somewhat separate, but I think they overlap and sometimes get confused. So the first is the activity of science, which is the pursuit of knowledge, of an understanding of the natural universe in a way that's both predictable and falsifiable. And so that's part 1. And then part 2, I think, is that science is this body of knowledge about the universe and the rules of the universe in a way that kind of we understand and we know to happen again and again. So like if someone jumps up and goes down, you say, why did I do that? Someone could say, well, that's science. So that's understood. So kind of one is a pursuit and the other is a grouping of kind of what we understand.
And what about the second part, which is how that informs the nature of the cosmos for you?
Right. So in terms of kind of how I see science and how it affects kind of how I see the universe, I think it gives me some appreciation of just kind of how amazing it is that we are here. So if you say the universe started with from nothingness, and then there's some hot soup, and then billions of years pass, and galaxies form, and the stars form, and then there's people, and now we're talking tonight on Zoom about all of this. That we could kind of go from there to here is amazing, and that we won some sort of lottery, I think. Now, I also think someone needed to win that lottery given the rules of the universe, but we're the ones who did, and it allows me to kind of just appreciate just kind of how fortunate we all are to be here and to have these kinds of conversations.
Ian, what do you think?
Okay, well, what is science? Let me be clear about the way I'm going to use the word science in this evening's discussion, and that's I'm going to basically restrict it to natural science. I think that's what Dan is doing too, judging by what he just said. But I don't mean all of knowledge. I mean natural science. Natural science is a way of understanding the world insofar as it is reproducible. It depends crucially on things like repeatable experiments and observations and so forth. And that's proven to be an amazingly abundant way of understanding our world. It's actually rather remarkable that we can understand it to the extent that we currently do, and it wasn't always clear to humans that they were going to be able to. And so that is one way, and a very important way, to understand the world insofar as it is reproducible. Now, you also ask a question about the cosmos. I'm going to take the cosmos to mean the universe, okay? And in a certain sense, that is all there is, at least all there is in the material world. And in that sense, I think there are no areas of our world which are forbidden to ask scientific questions about. But I also think that since in part physics itself shows that the universe is not entirely predictable, there are unpredictable aspects of the universe. And so it's indeed not all reproducible. And so I think that I, on that basis and on many others, conclude that science, although it's very important, and I practiced it all my professional life, it can't answer a lot of very important and interesting questions about our world and about ourselves. And so I think it's vital to have that balanced view of science.
So how do we apply that line of reasoning to the nature of humanity and the nature of man? What can science tell us about that, and what can science not tell us about that? And Ian, if you could just go ahead and take that one.
Well, science tells us that humans are, for example, animals, mammals. It tells us that we are continuous with the rest of nature, that we are subject to nature's principles, what we call the laws of nature, so that gravity applies to us as much as to the rest of the world around us that we see. If we jump out of an airplane, we fall. The conservation of energy applies to us. We can't survive unless we have food to replenish that energy, and that we're subject to biology and medicine and so forth. So that's what science tells us about humans. What science can't tell us is science can't tell us much about history or thought or politics or love or ethics or meaning or purpose or intentionality or aesthetics or philosophy or language or theology or pretty much anything that's immaterial. One of the things that I've been concerned about for many years is that a lot of people don't realize that science is essentially incapable of saying very much about any of those things. And they've taken the view, which I call scientism, that somehow science is all the real knowledge there is.
Dan, how would you respond to that?
Right. So, yeah, I don't want to say that science is all there is, but I also would kind of like to push back on this science can't tell us about love or happiness or thoughts. Right now, members of my family will have long conversations with the Siri or the Alexa in our house. Computers are getting better and better, and inside our heads, we have some hardware and some amazing software that we're just starting to understand. But kind of the better neuroscience gets, the more we can kind of reproduce a lot of these things that we call feelings and thoughts and love. And what I think science can't do, it can't do yet. So science can't say, why is it that you feel in love? How do you, what is love? But does that mean that science can never do that? I wouldn't bet against science in any way. I just think that we're just not there. So yes, science is limited right now, but that's a product of the progress of science currently and kind of where we are in scientific research, not a limitation to science itself.
So you don't accept that there are any natural limits to what science can usefully describe or investigate?
Well, so science itself has limitations. Like we have the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. We say you can't know an electron's speed and position at the same time. We say we can't know what happens before the first inflationary epoch of the universe. Like in science, there are absolute limits to how far science can go. So I think we're good at putting the limits that we need on ourselves. But I think in terms of kind of how the brain works, I am not sure if there is a limit to science. And if I had to bet, I would say there isn't.
Well, I certainly think science can say something about how the brain works, but that isn't the same thing as being able to explain meaning or intentionality or
Sure.
Language, for example. It just seems to me so blindingly obvious that these are things which we don't investigate through empirical means, that I'm a little bit surprised that you're unwilling to acknowledge that there almost certainly are things which eventually we'll find science won't address. Of course, science may change. We may change the meaning of the word science, but science, the way I mean it, I think is powerless to tell us much about most of those things that I just mentioned. I don't mean it says nothing. Of course, it says something, but it doesn't say very much about how they really matter.
Right. So I think we have to distinguish what science is bad at right now from what it can't do. Like right now, if we could write up this huge computer program to try to program how neural networks work, and we could kind of try to reproduce the brain, and we could get pretty close. And in the end, it could say, brains support the idea that you should love your kids. Now, we could spend the next 100 years doing that, and that's probably where we'll end up. And you could just look at your kid and you can love them. Now, one's a much longer process than the other, but that doesn't mean that science can't get there. It just means it's not great right now, and it's less straightforward.
So I'm going to redirect our conversation slightly, but I think we might be kind of getting at similar things. So maybe Dan first on this one. So on a kind of a broader level, should knowledge from science be seen as equal and opposite to religious knowledge? Or where do you kind of stand on whether they're similar or whether they're different? What do you think about that?
Right, great question. So my father's a rabbi, so we get along very well. So I won't say anything that is too strongly anti-religion. However, what I feel is that that when science has an answer, and what aligns with that answer is that you should be kind to people, then science should trump religion, that they should not be equal and opposite. They should not be equal. If science says, here's how climate change works, we should do something about it. If it says vaccines help people, science trumps. Now, there are places that science has limitations. Science is still very bad at saying, what does life mean? When someone's born, when they're dying, life is very hard to define. And I think that religion has a place where it's hard to get a good definition out of science and a good understanding out of science. But when that's not the case, when there's not kind of a clear view from when there is a clear view from science, I think that science should come first. And I think kind of one of the problems in our society right now is science way too often comes second, and that's what worries me.
Hmm. Now, Ian, I'm going to direct you to our next question, actually. So now that we've actually laid out a little bit more of how you each kind of view the world and how science applies to the world, what role do you think science should play in the public square? So I'm defining public square as basically where ideas are debated that can relate to society as a whole. So I'd love to see if you could answer that. Ian, we'll give you that first.
Okay, well, you didn't give me a chance to respond to Dan. I mean, I was going to ask Dan how on earth he would suppose that science would show that we should be kind to other people. Science deals with what is, not with what ought to be, and it is, as far as I can see, philosophically impossible to move in the way that you've implied that science can easily do. I know you're not alone in implying that, but I think that it's simply a mistake. So that's really the answer then, in terms of dealing with this question of the role in the public square. Science can tell us what is, or at any rate, what is reproducible in our world. And that's very important. It undergirds engineering, it undergirds technology, medicine, and so on and so forth. Terrifically important. Bridges have to not break, planes have to not crash, medical treatments have to work, and so forth. But science can't decide questions of value or significance, and so on, that are at the heart of politics. And so that's, my answer at any rate on the face of it to what the difference of the roles are in the public square.
Dan, what do you think?
Right, so first I just say, in terms of, let's take kindness, there's many courses at many universities called the science of kindness. So I absolutely do think that there is a scientific explanation for why
it's just a complete misnomer. Just because we say something is a science doesn't make it a science.
Well, no, you can say that, you could talk about evolution and doing best for one and best for all. These are things that make people kind. How do you attribute survival of the fittest to being kind? A lot of these things are.
But it doesn't give you a should. It doesn't give you a moral value. You can talk about the ways in which kindness can be implemented and what its results might be if we define it without emotion. But you can't say why we should do it. You cannot get a moral imperative out of science.
Yeah, okay. That I totally grant that is fair, that science does not give, in this case, a moral imperative. Now, something like religion does get a moral imperative, but if you knock on that, you say, well, where does that moral imperative come from? It comes from, some God or some person that you may or may not believe in. So if you want to contrast these two things, I struggle to kind of say one is giving a much better moral imperative than the other. At least kind of science, you can trace it, reproduce it, knock on it. With religion, I think that's much harder. Sorry, I'm worried that I may not be answering your question. Can you remind me what the original question was?
Sure. So what role do you think science should play in the public square?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think that when science presents, and science I kind of present, I talk about as a group, a consensus of scientists with peer-based research that has been verified in some way. You know, climate change is a very good example. When scientists say climate change is real, we're causing it, and we need to do something about it, that should trump any other thought that comes from spheres of kind of religion or other, I don't know, moral imperatives. Like if a religion says, well, it can't be that people could be causing the climate to change, science should win out. Science should always win, and I think we need to boost its role and its influence in the public sphere. And for now, what we're doing is we're saying, well, science says this, but there's all these other people, all these other organizations that say that, and somehow that's equal. I don't believe that those things should be equal.
So, fascinating views for each of you guys. So I think we're kind of getting to the point where your views are a little bit different. And so the second to last question I'm actually going to ask is, how do you decide between competing views? And Ian, Dan, I think you answered a little bit of that question. And so I want to pose that to Ian. Like, if you do have opposing views, how would you decide which one to go with within the public sphere?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize how much I agree with Dan, that when science has told us about what the consequences of certain actions are, or what the way that the universe is developed, and so on and so forth, we should pay attention to that. And I think that in general, scientific knowledge is one of the most certain types of knowledge that we have. And certainly I've worked on energy supply through fusion energy for most of my career, because I very much believe that we understand what we're doing to our climate enough to take an urgent view of that. But when it comes to political decisions, almost all key political decisions draw on both scientific knowledge and moral knowledge or value. And so it's really impossible to draw a line between these two types of knowledge or approach. What is important is, and what matters, is understanding the scope and the competence of different disciplines in the public square, and not trying to make a discipline answer questions that are beyond its competence. Now, it's certainly the case that if someone says, well, my religion teaches me that there is no climate change, not that there are people, as far as I know, that say that, but supposing there were, I think it would be perfectly reasonable for the majority of us in the public square to say, well, that's not a matter within the competence of, let's say, your sacred writings. But it's equally true that when scientists say that therefore we should do such and such and so, they are bringing to bear moral values that are not merely the province of science, they're the province of the humanities disciplines and indeed religious viewpoints as well. And so science, for example, can't answer questions about history. But on the other hand, history can't tell us how to make a radio receiver. And so, when we're talking about political decisions, you can never escape from there being a balance between science and other disciplines, the facts and the values. And those kinds of decisions almost always are of mixed type. You can't avoid it.
What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, so I guess I would ask, a couple follow-up questions just so I understand better. So I think part of what is a bit difficult is that kind of if we make the definition of science as like just kind of the physical universe and not say that people's actions can be understood scientifically, that people act in their own self-interests, that people will protect their family, that these are scientific truths, that there's neuroscience to back that, then if we would just want to say that science has to do with how Earth goes around the sun, sure. But I think if we are willing to broaden science to the understanding of the human brain, then I'm not so sure. But I guess what I want to ask is, I think a lot of the decisions that we should make politically, when we talk about a moral imperative, are just that we should be nice to each other, or love thy neighbor, if you will. Beyond that moral imperative that we should be kind to each other, what is it that we need outside of science? And I'm sorry for asking that naively, but I'm generally curious in what you think. Besides that we should just be nice to each other, what else is there?
Ian,
And that's a big
think?
one.
So I think you probably are pushing me to become a moral philosopher, which I'm going to resist. But let me answer to the best of my abilities. I mean, it seems to me that it isn't the case that all of morality boils down to being nice to one another. And I think there are moral dilemmas in our lives, even today, that are not that easy for us to resolve. And they're certainly not things that science can resolve. I mean, science can tell us, if you think about COVID, which is one of the things which faces us today, science can tell us what will happen under certain circumstances. Actually, it very often can't tell us very clearly what all the consequences will be because it's incomplete. And that's, of course, both the strength and the weakness of science is that it's always, in a certain sense, incomplete. And frankly, I feel as though part of what you're trying to do is to take credit for what you think is going to be future science when you speak as if, we're going to know enough about the brain to understand thought or to understand what kindness really is or understand morality. We are so far from that you're taking credit for something that actually is not by no means on the horizon. Okay. I agree, we will make progress. We'll learn how the brain works. But when we learn how the brain works, that will not tell us how thought works, because thought is so much more complex than the physical functioning of the brain, that it will still remain a meaning in its own right. So, for example, if we were to boil down thought to the point where it was nothing but the firing of neurons and the opening of chemistry and so on and so forth, we would still not be able to say that we had reduced thought to the physical, because if we did, then the meaning of the thought itself would evaporate. And so such an outlook on the brain is, in my view, philosophically untenable. It's illogical. It's self-defeating. We have to take note of what the higher level meanings that are encompassed in complexity if we're to understand the world at all, because otherwise there's no such thing as understanding.
Ian, I think we're just scratching the surface of this conversation. Dan, do you have just a short response? And then we'll kind of segue.
Yeah, so I think we agree on a good amount of this. I think that what's tough is that science is a changing discipline, and kind of we just do not know kind of how far it's going to go. But kind of I would flip it back and say that we say, okay, well, science is limited, and therefore we have religion to kind of tell us how we should be. But there's not just one religion. In one religion, there's many different parts of it, different moral imperatives. So this kind of thinking of like, oh, not science. There's there's just one other thing. Well, you have many different options to choose from for other things. And yes, everyone should have that choice. Science is not going to provide all the answers right now, and even 100 years, it's gonna be very hard. But I think kind of when science is at the table and provides a clear view, science is what we should take.
Well,
wow, okay. I'm going to have to actually segue us out. This is such a fantastic conversation, and that's going to end, unfortunately, the discussion tonight. Thank you guys both for being here. My sincerest thanks. Thank you guys all for joining us.